The sermon title is called Challenging Times, Reflections on Psalm 46. If you want to turn to Psalm 46, you can. I ran into this psalm again a couple of weeks ago when I was reading, and I felt like the Lord said, this is what I want you to talk about for this Sunday, before we get to Thanksgiving, before we get to the holidays. And so what I'm going to ask you to pay attention to is everything, but specifically in your own heart. How are you doing with God? How are you doing in terms of feeling the weight of the world, which is significant right now, whether you're election followers or war followers or circumstances in your own life followers? What I'm aware of, it just in our church body, there's an inordinate amount of heavy weight. And so this is what the Lord asked me to talk on as best as I understand. You may recognize this quote. Sir Edward Grey at the start of World War I said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe, and we shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." When the First World War started, not unexpected, the world had gotten to its place where there was an assassination that started the war. But had that assassination not happened, then the war just would have happened a few weeks later. And if something hadn't happened then, it would have happened a few weeks after that. Everyone was ready for war. The First World War, as you know, was followed by the Second. And most historians would say it was just there was a pause in between. The man that was growing up through this war period that I want to just talk about briefly is Harry Truman. Harry Truman is President of the United States, the 33rd president. He is ranked as the most underrated president in U.S. history in terms of the importance of what was taking place in the world, how he responded to it, and then his relative popularity after the fact. He oversaw lots of things. Lincoln, he gets a lot of press and definitely should. FDR gets a lot of press and should. Truman was a very odd man. He was a sort of a social outcast, even in the political world. When he was young, the First World War starts, he wanted to support the war effort. He was already in the military, but re-signed up. He was in the National Guard and decided, I want to help. So he went and took his physical, because you have to take a physical. And when he did his physical, he passed the physical, except in the bottom of the sheet, the doctor wrote blind, because his eyesight was so bad. And when you're blind, you're not supposed to serve in the military. Well, they put him in because it was the First World War. They needed people, and so their thinking was that he's blind, so we'll put him in artillery, because you don't have to see what you're shooting at. You just point a gun a long ways away and shoot it. And so he fought with the 6th Artillery Corps in France. He managed to get through the war. He survived. He was a captain, got some notoriety there, and ended up going into politics after he got out of the war. He finished at that time was the largest conflict ever in history. Gets into politics. He ends up being a aide for FDR. As a young politician, he had met FDR. Roosevelt liked him, brought him in, and he ends up in a place where he's Assistant Secretary of State when the Second World War starts. He's an assistant to FDR. He ends up getting a lot of attention, positive attention when he's working there. And unbeknownst to anyone other than Roosevelt himself, when the last election that Roosevelt was going to run for, he decided to make Truman his vice president. So Truman ends up vice president of the United States, and he's sworn into office in 1945 and ends up being the vice president for 3 months, because then Roosevelt died. So Truman, who's thinking, I'm way over my head as vice president, ends up president of the United States in the midst of the Second World War. When he's president of the United States, we end up with victory over Europe, over the Germans in Europe, over the Axis powers, and then we end up having to drop atomic bombs on Japan, or whatever you think about the historical fact. We did drop atomic bombs. He's the only president to ever use atomic weapons. He gets us through the Second World War. Japan surrenders. He's at the office with his crew, and a guy named Atchison is in office, Dean Atchison, with the President of the United States, and says to the President, he says, look, you survived the First World War. You led us through the Second World War. Let's light the lamps of Europe again. Remembering the statement from the beginning of World War I, where the lamps were going out all over Europe, and they wouldn't be lit again in our lifetime. And so Dean Atchison says to the President, let's light the lamps of Europe again. And Truman says, that's what we should do. So they start the Marshall Plan, which is to rebuild Europe. The plan is to use American dollars to rebuild everything that American dollars blew up. It was a good plan. 4 months after they start the Marshall Plan, and Dean Atchison has said to Harry Truman, let's light the lamps of Europe again. Winston Churchill is in the United States, and Churchill is speaking in an auditorium that Harry Truman's standing next to him, and Truman says this, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. What he was talking about was the beginning of the Cold War. Harry Truman fought in the First World War, lived through it, led us through the Second World War, survived the presidency, was reelected again, only to find himself in what many consider the Third World War, the Cold War. Harry Truman, at the end of his presidency, said, some people draw the short straw more than once. His perception was that he had failed as president. His perception was that he, as a leader of the free world, didn't measure up to FDR, and he certainly didn't measure up to some of the classic greats like Washington and Lincoln. But what Truman didn't realize was the scope of what he was engaged in. The 20th century, the more people died in war than all the centuries prior. The 20th century was this devastating set of conflicts after conflict after conflicts. Harry Truman, at the end of his life, still believed that he was not an adequate president because he'd self-evaluate all the time. His last statement was, I was born blind, I lived blind, and I will die blind. And what he meant by that was, I just can't see my own position in the world and what I've accomplished. I was born blind, I lived blind, and I will die blind. Why I talk about that at all is this. There are times in life and there are places in life where it seems like I just got through one thing and another thing comes. It's harder than the last. And I get through that thing and then I feel like I've done my duty, I've done all these things, I've survived this and I've survived that, and then something else comes along. Doesn't matter if that's COVID or whatever it might be. One thing after another. And I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but if just ask you to take a assess, have you ever felt like, man, it's just one thing after another, after another? When I'm listening to what's happening with Flor, I've got to believe, the family in Mexico, I've got to believe, she's like, man, really, one thing after another, after another. When I think about places I've visited and hear folks in our church, it seems like just one thing after another. Psalm 46 says this, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. Continues on, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the seas, though its waters roar and foam, the mountains quake with their surging. That section, it reads a little funny, but that section is referencing back to God's our reference, and we're not going to, or our refuge, and we're not going to fear, even though these things happen. So look at the things that it's talking about. Though the earth give way. Anyone know what that actually means? An earthquake? Avalanche? We go just one line down. The mountains fall into the heart of the sea. Ever seen that? I haven't. I've seen avalanches. I think avalanches are pretty interesting. I'll go on YouTube once in a while. My brother will send it back and forth. We send little videos of avalanches. Amazing power. Giant fields of ice sliding down a hill and taking out trees and rocks and mountains. And when I read this, though the waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging, what I picture is the author going, I wanted to describe as best I can absolute catastrophe, complete human lack of control. I've only lived through a couple of earthquakes, but they're very unnerving. When the thing you're used to being, the only stability in the whole world is the world, and the world moves, it's very unnerving. And that's what I think he's trying to describe here, when things are completely unstable. When the foundations have broken and slid, what does he say? We will not fear. Here's my trouble with Psalm 46. I do fear. I do at times. When certain things happen, I have fear. I actually think that's normal. I think it's human. I think it's part of what we're wired with, is this desire, this need to protect ourselves, to keep ourselves safe. It makes some sense. I want my kids, when they were young, to have a fear of moving trains. I wanted my kids to have a certain level of fear of that dog that's not on a leash. There's a naturalness to fear. And then we read there, it says, but I am not supposed to fear even when the earth gives way. Psalm 42 says this, why are you in despair, O my soul? Why have you become disturbed within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him for the help of his presence. O my God, my soul is in despair within me. When you get a phone call and someone says, I have cancer, it's natural to have some fear if you care about them. If it's a family member, you're even more disturbed. Just finding out maybe you lost your job, or you watched your stock portfolio in the last 6 months. It's natural to have some fear. If we read through Psalm 46 and land at, I will not fear, all we have to do is flip back to Psalm 42 and go, well, wait, this author is afraid, is in despair. His soul is in despair within him, he says. Therefore, I remembered you from the land of the Jordan. When you read Psalm 42, you have to go through the fear to get to, then I remembered you. You have to live the fear before you could even write Psalm 42 or Psalm 46. If it weren't for fear, Psalm 42 and Psalm 46 wouldn't exist, because there'd be no reason to write them. I've never had the experience of fear. Why would I write about it? The purpose of these Psalms is to help us when we do have fear. It's to give us a light on the path down the road that includes fear and ends with the Lord. So we'll get back to Psalm 46. There's this interesting center section. It says, there's a river whose streams make glad the city of God. The city of God is Jerusalem. There's a river that runs through it. There's actually two that run through Jerusalem. And which one he's talking about, we don't know. But it says there's a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the most holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her. That means God's within the river. A river, when a city is attacked, the lifeblood of that city is if there's a river that flows through it. Because you can live a long time without food, but you can't without water. If you have a fresh source of water going through the river, and Jerusalem did. And that's what God is within that river. He's giving us an image of the presence of God going through our territory in the midst of catastrophe. That God is there. But now look at this. God will help her at the break of day. When does day happen? After night, by definition. God will help her after the night has happened. Well, why wouldn't God help before the night happens? He does, but we don't see it because there's nothing to compare it with. That presence of that river is always there. The blessing of that river is always there. The need for that river is only during catastrophe. And it's not till the sun comes up again that you can see what God's been doing. God will help her at the break of day. Nations are in uproar and kingdoms fall. Definitely a clear picture that's taking place here, one that we probably can relate with. He lifts his voice and the earth melts. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. This is as far as Mark read. Nations are in uproar. Sounds pretty 21st century, 20th century, 19th century. I could count back, but we have limited time. Every century of war. It's the nature of man. Nations are in uproar and kingdoms fall. Psalm continues on. We'll go back to that here in a second. If you feel like I cheated you out of it, we'll go back. Come and see what the Lord has done, the desolations he has brought on the earth. That doesn't sound good. The desolations he has brought on the earth. Why does it say it like that? Because there's nothing that happens on earth that hasn't gone through the hands of the Lord. Nothing. That does not mean that everything that happens is what God would have, in the perfect world, have designed, but it does mean that God's still God. It does mean that God will use desolations for kingdom purposes. We were praying about this morning. The wars that are taking place right now, God will use them. How do we know that? Because he promises that. He can use all things together for good. We all know that verse, but boy, it's hard to apply it. I can use everything for good. Why is that hard for us to understand? Because our definition of good is very different than God's. When God says he could use it for good, that means for kingdom. Not everybody on earth is going to have the positive outcome on earthly situations, because the kingdom is what God's working for. We have these kind of, boy, it doesn't seem like life's fair. You've got people that have money and people who don't have money. You have people who die when they're 20 and people who die when they're 120. Sometimes it seems like the ones that live to be 120 should have been the ones that died when they were 20. But that's not our choice to make. God does not say, I can use all things together for fair. I will use all things together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. We have to have that perception. My good isn't good. God's good is good. And that might look bad for some of us. It's very hard to get our minds around. He makes wars cease, and we pray for that, to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear and burns the shields with fire. The author here is trying to get us to understand that even in these astronomically catastrophic conflicts, God's still in control. He could end this war or that war or any war in a moment. Second World War, 80 million dead. 80 million dead. I can use all things together for good. That's confusing to me. Don't understand it. But God promises it. What happened in the Second World War, we don't have time to talk about. We could go war by war by war and go, okay, God did do things. Simply the eradication of Nazism on earth. It's hard to be a Nazi nowadays. It comes out that you're a Nazi, most people don't like you. Nazism was the result or the cause of millions and millions of death. So simply the taking of that and going, okay, well, here God's going to make one thing clear. You're not going to be socially acceptable as a Nazi. And yet they had become the most powerful organization on the planet in the 1930s, 1940s. It's hard to get those guys going now. It'd be hard to start up a new group. They're there. But God did do good things through what seems like awful circumstances. He says, now notice this, we get through verse 8, 9 of Psalm 46 before God speaks. And then God speaks. He says this, be still and know that I am God. That's a good verse. Be still. You know what be still means? Be still. It's so hard to be still in our world. It is hard. We have the ability to control most of our circumstances, don't we? We do. We have the ability to go get food, to get water. All we got to do is walk over there, we can get water. We can walk over there and get food. If we don't have any money, we can just get a piece of cardboard and a black pen and stand outside on the highway, and we will have more money by the end of the day than most people in the rest of the world could get in a single day. We have the ability to control our circumstances. If we get sick, we can go to the doctor. If we don't want to go to the doctor, we can go get medicine. If we don't want to go get medicine, we at least have a comfortable place to sit down until we feel better. We can control our lives. And God's saying, sit down. Stop. The actual phrase is cease striving and know that I'm God. I'll say it for you different. Stop it. That's what he's saying. Stop it. Now look what it said in verse 6 and 7. Nations are in an uproar, kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice, and what happens? The earth melts. Some people have a problem with psalm language sometimes because the earth never melted. I mean, you've got little volcanoes here and there, but the earth doesn't melt, and the author knows that. But what he's saying is this, it could. If God wanted to melt the earth, all he'd have to do is lift his voice. If he wanted to liquefy this whole thing, just lift his voice, and it would melt. And then he says immediately after that, the Lord Almighty is with us. How amazing is that? That the God of the universe, that could simply speak the melting of the planet, is here with us right now. And he's at home with you right now. And whoever's watching online, whether it's taped or not, he's there with them right now. It's so hard to get that into my head. I can't speak for you, but it is for me. A week ago, my wife and I were away. We were in church last week because we were away, and there were some circumstances. It was like, man, I don't like these circumstances. I don't like what's going on. I don't like this. And it was in my mind, this will never change. Just so it's clear, it's not talking about between my wife and I. My wife and I are doing great. You guys back there, oh, we need a marriage counselor, quick. No, that's not it. 1-800, no. But there are some circumstances that were sad for my heart, my wife's heart. We asked, do you think it does any good to pray for this? And I'll be dead honest with you. I thought, no. The pastor of your church, I know, fire me, 1-800-PASTOR. But in my heart of hearts, like, no, this one's outside of God's hands. And if you ever want to know what I was talking about sometime, I'd be happy to explain it to you and explain to you why. But it's taken me to working through this sermon, which might be the only, you might just have to suffer through this because it had to happen for me, but for me to go, man, my thinking is wrong. And it took several other circumstances of me being with other people and hearing them say in so many words, I don't think this is ever going to get better. For it to sink into me to go, wait a minute. If God just uses his voice, he can melt the earth. What do you mean he can't fix this? Do I mean that he will fix it right now? Not at all. But I have to get into my head Psalm 46. Sit down and let me be God. Sit right there and stop it. Here's how bad I am. We're doing Pop-Tart Sunday. And I'm driving here thinking 3 people can show up. And it's going to bum my wife out because it was her idea. It's going to bum my Sunday out. I should text a couple people. That's after putting the sermon together. I got to manage my Sunday afternoon. Please come eat Pop-Tarts. I got to sit down. Stop thinking that I got to control things. I got to manage things. If nobody came to Pop-Tart Sunday, if God decides not to change the thing that my wife and I were engaged with and for years, does it mean he won't? It doesn't. I think so short term. It's always going to be this way. When I say that, what I mean by it's going to be this way tomorrow, going to be that way the next day, and I can't really perceive it ever changing unless God's actually God. God says this, I will be exalted among the nations. I'll be exalted on the earth. Do you see that happening? Because I don't. Whether it's American political systems or Ukrainian-Russian wars or across the board, I don't see God being exalted right now. But do you know what he said? He said there'll be a time when every knee will bow. Every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. I hear on the news people saying Christianity is fading. Let it fade. Because there will be a day when every knee will bow. Not because we make it happen. Not because of something we do. But at some point, God's going to stand up and everybody else is going to kneel down. We don't have anything to do with that. We just need to sit down and let God be God. Here's what he said in there. The earth will give way. The mountains fall into the heart of the sea. The waters roar and foam. The mountains will quake. Wars and bows and spears and shields. Useless. All the tools of man, all the things we use to fight with, everything that we're afraid of, earth collapsing, mountains falling, waters roaring, all the things that we're afraid of. And it would be really easy to go, okay, well, it says be still and know that I'm God. So God's just saying that, well, just chill out, you'll be fine, don't be afraid. That's not what he's saying. Remember Psalm 23? Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I won't fear any evil. That's the end of the journey. I will for a while. If I get a phone call someday, my doctor calls up and says, hey, man, we found something on your CAT scan. I promise you I will have a certain level of fear. Worse than that, if somebody calls and someone in my family has something on their CAT scan, I will have fear. And that's why these verses exist, to steer me back, to get me to the place where I can walk that road. I can go through the valley of the shadow of death. I can fear no evil. Why? Because God's with me. So I want you for just a second to close your eyes. I've asked several people over the last few years to read a book called The Practice of the Presence of God. I've talked about it in sermons. I hate the book at one level because the guy in it is very simplistic. And he makes it seem so easy. Because what he has got his hand around is that God's just right there with him. And with you where you're at. This is a practice that I know I need to do, and that's why I've asked you to close your eyes. I think it's a practice that most believers need to learn, is how to go, God's right here with me. He's right here with me now. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, God's here. And what do I know to be true about God? He's powerful and he's present with you. So this is going to seem a little weird, but what I want you to do is take one of your two hands and put your hand on your shoulder. Just reach your hand up, put it on the other shoulder. It's hard to put it on the same one. Put it on the other one. Your right hand on your left shoulder. And this is going to seem dorky, and I'm fine with that. Just imagine for a second that God's got his hand on your shoulder, and he's saying to you, I'm God. Be still. I'm God. Be still. Because where Psalm 46 started was, he is an ever-present help. He is an ever-present help. Right there with you, right now, whatever it is you're trying to walk through, whether it's finances or health or fatigue or relationships, and I could make the list on and on and on. But God's got his hand on your shoulder saying, I'm God. Be still. When God lifts his voice, the earth melts. He can take care of what you've got. What you need to say to him is I know you're here, and I know your timing is better than mine. I'll walk with you. Be still and know that I am God. God, I'd ask that you would help us remember that you would press it into our minds that we don't have to strive. We have to do our best, but we don't have to strive. You want us to walk, but you want us to walk with you. You know we're designed to fear. It's part of who we are. But we want to grow into men and women of courage that can walk through the valley of the shadow of death and not fear evil, because we know you are with us. Put that in our hearts. Put that on our lips. Help us to remind each other of it. Help us to remind ourselves. Be still and know that I am God. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you guys. Hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Is that a week from now? Is that this a week from now? You know, in my mind, it's that. So there we go. So God bless you guys.